That's modern for me, and that's Motherwell for me, just part of it.
Mr. Motherwell? Puts you on the spot a bit.
From my point of view, modern obviously began as a temple word and still has that meaning, but what's really implied by it, and in that sense I think it's a creative aesthetic tradition that's gone on for more than 150 years, and maybe the most brutal and direct way of saying it is all art of the world, in every period, every country, everything has produced very great art, but it's all been tribal art. And for me, modernism is the first art that is an art of complete individuals in a society in which we're basically, with a few pockets here and there in America and Europe and so on, not tribal people, but specific individuals expressing specifically individual things. And it's also true that in tribal society, one can differentiate between Titian and Tintoretto, or Uccello and Giotto, or African and South Seas to some degree, but I think it's not known, for example, many of the great Romanesque sculptors of the cathedrals of France and so on, because they had absolutely in common that they were craftsmen making the idols of the tribes they belonged to, whether it was Jesus Christ or Voodoo or Jehovah or Allah and so on. And what makes it difficult in modern times is, from the point of view of ideas of progress and so on, it fractures society more and more, plus the Industrial Revolution uprooting, in the most literal sense, all tribes from being basically agricultural with certain things built in, the seasons, etc., that are so important in a way that they're less and less to us. And then, so that now to talk in more immediate antecedents until, I don't know, say around the middle of the 19th century, and I suppose Baudelaire's essay, La Vie Moderne, it was really an argument that no longer do we have to paint the lords and ladies, no longer do we have to paint the religious icons, no longer do we have to paint the world of power and glory. We can paint what interests us. And the English, who have been the least modernist as a whole culture, I think, turned to landscape as a way out that was neutral, was not making monuments out of institutions and people. And Baudelaire insists again and again, we don't need historical painting. I mean, Greek gods appearing as Madonnas, or we don't need all of that mythology. Look at the carriages in the street and all the rest of it. And the instant there's not a collective consensus of what the icons and idols of the tribe are, I think that's modernism. And in that sense, for the foreseeable future, I cannot see that there is any aesthetic other than of individualism that could possibly replace it, if I make myself clear. And then you can pick out easily in literature or music or painting or architecture who are the modernists and who are not. Now, even though we're a herd of individuals, there is a very strong remaining tribal resistance against what we're all aspiring to be, which is individuals. So that then there becomes a basic conflict, especially to the less literate the observer is. Because with any work of art, it's a transaction between the maker and the observer, or the listener, or the reader. In the readers, or the listeners, or the lookers, tend to be, no matter how much they defend individualism, in many ways much more still conventionally carrying around remnants of the tribal tradition than the people who would venture as far as they can as to what is really my identity, my individuality, my particular perception of the world. And in a funny way, that involves what's the other great source of resistance, nationalism. And the real struggle in painting in America in the last 50 years was the effort of some of us to use world standards, international standards, instead of Americana.
Would you say it gives freer rein to the unconscious modernism? I mean, would that be one way of looking at it?
Absolutely, and I would say that people's unconscious has much more in common than their consciousness. And the instant one begins to think that way, then you see this statue of this gentleman, I can't read it from here, is to make him a Roman senator, or whatever it is, which is to say reinforce a patrician immortality in a way that I think if you talk to youngsters nowadays and said, how would you like your statue done as a Roman senator, they'd look at you and say, what?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with what one considers an acceptable public presentation of self.
Well, it's why modernists have to ignore the audience, not out of contempt, but out of and I shouldn't say ignore, that's not correct. I mean, it has to go the way an experimental scientist has to go where the research is leading him, regardless of what the general public thinks. I mean, these things have their own internal logic, and as all of us know, and one ignores that in relation to general opinion at one's peril. And fortunately, no creative people have any real power. So I don't know why there, in a way, should be such hostility, because what can my paintings do to anybody? Nothing. It can't change anything, it can't do anything. Occasionally somebody might feel a certain bit of empathy, or, oh gee, I like that blue, or whatever. But that's the most it can do, really, even though it's my effort to have one human soul make contact with another human soul. But I also believe there are half a dozen, at least in visual terms, natural psychologies almost. If you think of Vermeer and Rembrandt as being exact contemporaries, and think of how optical, how photographic, how highlighted, how clean, how smooth the surface of Vermeer compared to Rembrandt's being made, it's almost as though he could make mud magical, and so on. And just the other night I saw a film of Rembrandt that I saw 40 or 50 years ago by Karl Zuckmayer, made in London, and during the war, the World War. And the thing that struck me as it did then was that Rembrandt's life in this film takes place in Vermeer interiors, because Vermeer shows you what Amsterdam looked like then. And there's nothing marvelous with this beard nose and frowsled hair and brushes and looking for this and that and the other thing, and his rejection, because he's not glossy. See, when in those days, the kings of England were the arbiters of taste for Europe, and Rubens' pupil, what's his name?
Van Dyck.
Van Dyck was appointed court painter to England. That destroyed Rembrandt's market on the spot. And I'm not talking about the money, but I mean, it made it impossible for him to do things that he wanted to do and could have done. And in that sense, modernism is also a cause. And I would think in all of the arts, there's a savage struggle, really, between modernists and, let's say, nationalists or tribalists. And that's one of the reasons Boston is so unvisual, is the tribe is much stronger here than in most places. Excuse me.